Hello everyone, my name is Gabriel, and today I'm really excited to be presenting on behalf of my co-authors our work titled Others Are to Blame, Whom People Consider Responsible for Online Misinformation. Our research starts with the question of who is responsible for online misinformation. In fact, there's quite a lot of finger-pointing going around. News media often blame social media platforms for spreading misinformation. On the other hand, some discuss the possibility of news media themselves being responsible for misinformation by disseminating falsehoods through their efforts to debunk them. Another line of work investigates who online users and the general public more broadly considers responsible for online misinformation. This research has been largely conducted by the Pew Research Center and has identified several actors that people consider responsible. Our research expands on these previous efforts and addresses three main research questions. First, who do people consider responsible for creating, disseminating, and failing to prevent online misinformation? Past work from Pew has focused only on specific aspects, such as only creation or just prevention. In this work, we address these three together. Second, how does political orientation influence who is considered responsible? Previous research suggests that there might be some differences across the political spectrum, so we investigate whether the political orientation of participants influences who they deem responsible. Third, and finally, we ask, do people perceive themselves as players in online misinformation? There is some work, particularly from Penny Cook and colleagues, that show that people might share misinformation unintentionally. Thus, we ask, do people perceive themselves as responsible for online misinformation? In the paper, we present the results of two studies. However, due to some time limitations, I focus on study 2 in this presentation. But before we move on to the results, let me explain a little bit about study 1. So in study 1, participants wrote down 3 entities that they consider responsible for online misinformation, and 3 entities for each aspect of online misinformation, for the creation, dissemination, and the prevention. We then went over all of these open-ended responses and coded them qualitatively. We clustered responses into several actors that people deemed responsible. We also found that some people were explicit about political orientation and that the majority of respondents externalized responsibility. In other words, they blamed other people and not themselves, and often used derogatory terms to refer to other people, such as ignorant, dumb, and many others. Study 2 expanded on each of the study 1's findings and basically explored them further. First, participants selected whom they deemed responsible for each aspect of online misinformation, but from a list of entities that we compiled from study 1. Participants then answered who was relatively more to blame among conservatives and liberals, addressing people's tendency to actually be explicit about political orientation. And third, participants agreed or disagreed with a series of 11 statements governing their perceived role in online misinformation, focusing on this issue of externalization of responsibility. So now let's move on to our results. Our first main finding was that different actors were deemed responsible for distinct aspects of online misinformation. So when we look at creation, we see that people usually mention online users, conspiracy theorists, interest groups, and politicians as responsible for the creation of falsehoods. On the other hand, when we're talking about prevention, people usually point at social media platforms, news media outlets, the government, and politicians as responsible for failing to prevent misinformation from spreading. We also found a clear political polarization in our results. Democrats, independents, and Republicans blame the same actors for online misinformation. All of them mentioned news media outlets, the general public, and politicians. However, they focus on those in the opposite side of the political spectrum. So for instance, let's give an example of the news media. Democrats mentioned conservative outlets such as Fox News, whereas Republicans, for the most part, blamed CNN and other liberal outlets. Now, looking at the perceived accountability of participants, we found that people do care about the accuracy of the information that they are exposed to, and they actually think that they do everything that they can when posting and sharing content online. However, they are not really sure what they can do to prevent misinformation from spreading. So, as a summary, what we found is that there lacks personal accountability among online users. More than 70% of participants blamed users for spreading misinformation. But the problem is that they do not see themselves as part of the problem. In the paper, we discussed several ways to promote personal accountability, for instance, through online interventions and media literacy. We found that both social media and news media were considered highly responsible for misinformation. More than 50% of participants thought that news media is to blame, and highlighting that these outlets should be aware of how they might disseminate misinformation unintentionally. Social media companies were considered the most responsible actor for the failure to prevent falsehoods from spreading. More than 65% of participants thought that social media should prevent misinformation. And this shows how people expect the current efforts that have been, for instance, deployed in the US during the latest presidential election should be expanded to other countries and other events. Finally, we found a really stark political polarization in our results. Even though liberals and conservatives blame the same actors for misinformation, they focus on those that they disagree with politically. This is an intriguing and worrying result because political polarization can be a barrier to the effective regulation and the prevention of online misinformation. Finally, in the paper, we defend a joint accountability framework under which all of these entities come together to combat misinformation. So for the side of the online users, we highlight the importance of personal accountability to make sure that people are aware of how they might disseminate misinformation unintentionally. In terms of politicians, we highlight that they should cross the aisle and collaborate with those that they disagree with politically so that they can solve this issue that affects both of them equally. In terms of news media, we highlight how news media should be responsible for disseminating accurate information, but they must also be aware of how they might unintentionally share inaccurate information and disseminate it even more through their efforts to debunk these falsehoods. Finally, for social media, we defend that the current efforts that have been taken, particularly in the US, should be expanded to different circumstances to ensure that misinformation is combated all around the world and effectively. So thank you very much for listening. I'm looking forward to any questions that you may have in the online platform and in the live session. And thank you very much.